Okay, so today we're diving into a meeting that honestly had the whole world kind of holding its breath. You know the one I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah. This one's a doozy.
The Oval Office. Former President Trump, Ukrainian President Zelensky,
Can't get much higher stakes than that.
and they're talking about war, military aid, the future of Ukraine hanging in the balance.
And you really got to remember, for Zelensky, this wasn't just some photo op. This was his chance to secure the U.S. support that Ukraine desperately needed. I mean, the man was leading a country at war.
And the crazy thing is, right after this super intense exchange with Zelensky, Trump apparently says this is going to be great television.
Wow.
It almost makes you wonder, was he more focused on the drama than actually, doing diplomacy?
It's a good question. And honestly, it's one that pops up a lot when you look at Trump's time in office.
Right. Like, was it all about, the show, or was there some serious diplomacy happening too?
Yeah.
And then there's Zelensky showing up in full military garb. I mean, what's your take on that? Was that a power move? A strategic decision?
Well, put yourself in Zelensky's shoes for a second. Leading a country under attack, sitting across from arguably the most powerful guy in the world, and he chooses to wear a uniform that symbolizes his wartime leadership. You know?
So you're thinking it was more than just a fashion choice?
I think it's safe to say that it was a statement, you know? Maybe even a way to subtly emphasize just how urgently Ukraine needed help. And then you've got Trump on the other side of the table, who seems more focused on Zelensky's clothes, even making comments about him being all dressed up.
The contrast is pretty wild.
Yeah, it is.
It's almost like you're watching two different things happening at the same time. You've got Zelensky with this clear objective, get military aid, and then you've got Trump, who seems way more interested in how things look and pushing his deal of the century peace plan, which, by the way, our sources paint as a pretty take it or leave it kind of deal.
Right, and that's super important to understand. Zelensky wasn't in any position to be bullied. He was fighting for his country's survival. So any deal had to actually benefit Ukraine, not just help Trump politically.
And then just to add to the pressure cooker, Trump drops this line, "You don't have the cards right now. You're gambling with World War III." I mean, talk about intense.
Yeah. When you think about the power dynamics there, it's pretty chilling. Whether he meant it or not, Trump was essentially using the threat of global conflict to force Zelensky's hand.
It's crazy. And to make things even weirder, you got J.D. Vance. Now he's the vice president, but back then he was this rising political star.
Yeah.
And he comes out criticizing Zelensky for publicly asking for help. What was that all about?
Vance's statement where he basically criticizes Zelensky for asking for help. That's worth taking a closer look at because you don't usually see that from a U.S. official, especially when a country is fighting for its survival.
Right.
So it makes you wonder, was this an attempt to weaken Zelensky's position, make him look bad going into these crucial talks?
It really adds to this feeling that this meeting wasn't just about regular diplomacy. It was about shaping the story, controlling how the public saw everything.
Exactly. Which brings us to another strange thing. The canceled joint press conference.
Yeah, that was super weird. After a high-level meeting like this, you usually have both leaders giving statements, answering questions, the whole diplomatic dance.
It's a whole 9 yards.
Yeah, but this time, nothing silences. Why do you think they skipped it?
It's definitely unusual. Was it a calculated move by Trump to manage the message, or was something else going on behind the scenes? It makes you think. By canceling the press conference, they basically shut down any chance for journalists to ask hard questions or challenge their version of events.
So we end up with this incredibly tense, secretive meeting where the focus seems to shift from actual diplomacy to this weird political theater. And controlling the story, it's almost like they were more interested in writing the script than actually solving anything.
It is pretty bizarre when you think about it that way.
Yeah, and it leaves us with a lot of unanswered questions about how things really went down.
For sure. You know, this whole meeting with the theatrics and all the stuff happening behind the scenes, it really makes you think about the future of diplomacy. Like, is this the new normal?
Yeah. Is this what we're going to see from now on? More staged events where it's all about manipulating people instead of actually dealing with the real issues?
And what kind of message does that send to other world leaders? Like, if they want America's help, do they have to play along with this reality show diplomacy?
It's a scary thought, for sure.
Yeah, it's a huge question with implications for global politics as a whole. I mean, if the world stage becomes more about performance than actual substance, it could really damage trust and cooperation between countries.
It's like everyone's playing chess with the news cycle instead of actually working together to find solutions.
And that can easily make things worse. I mean, when leaders are more worried about looking good in the news than finding common ground, it raises the stakes and makes conflict more likely.
So this Trump-Zelensky meeting, it could be like a preview of a much bigger trend.
I think so.
This whole blurring of lines between politics and entertainment, the obsession with image and controlling the narrative, it's all part of this world where what people see often matters more than what's actually happening.
Exactly. And as we're trying to figure out this new world, it's so important to understand these dynamics and how they could impact international relations.
Right. Like we need to ask ourselves, are we okay with diplomacy becoming basically a form of reality TV?
It's something we all need to think about. It shows how important critical thinking and media literacy are these days, you know? We can't just passively take in information. We need to analyze it, question it, and think about the motivations behind the messages we're constantly getting bombarded with.
We can't just believe everything we see and hear.
Absolutely. We need to be able to separate real diplomacy from political theater, to see the substance and not just the spin. Otherwise, we're just pawns for those who are more interested in controlling the story than actually fixing problems.
So going back to this meeting,
Yeah.
the big question is, was this between Trump and Zelensky about serious diplomacy, or was it more about political theater and controlling the narrative?
Based on what we've talked about, it seems like it was a bit of both. Obviously, there were big issues on the table, but the way they handled it, the focus on how things looked, the canceled press conference, it all suggests that there was a real effort to manage perceptions and shape the story.
Like they were trying to write the headlines themselves.
Yeah, it's a really interesting look at how politics, diplomacy, and media all intersect in the 21st century. And it leaves us with some things to think about as we try to make sense of this crazy world.
It really does. You know, speaking of the press conference, that was a weird one. Usually after these meetings, you have the leaders making statements, taking questions.
Right, the usual diplomatic routine.
But this time, nothing. Total silence. What do you think was behind that?
It's hard to say for sure, but it could be that they wanted to avoid any tough questions or any moments that might have contradicted the story they were trying to tell.
Or maybe they just wanted to keep everyone guessing.
Could be. A little mystery can be a powerful tool in politics.
For sure. And by controlling the information, they control the narrative.
Exactly. And in a way, they control how people see reality.
Which brings us to another interesting part of this meeting, Trump's deal of the century peace plan. And our sources suggest it wasn't exactly a diplomatic masterpiece.
It really wasn't. And it's important to understand why this wasn't some carefully crafted peace proposal that came from negotiation and compromise. It was more like a take it or leave it kind of thing. And that probably didn't sit well with Zelensky, who, as we talked about, was in a really tough spot.
Especially with the threat of World War III hanging over his head.
Exactly. Zelensky was desperate for aid and facing pressure from both Russia and the U.S. And then Trump shows up with this deal that might not have actually been good for Ukraine. It was a high-stakes game, and Zelensky didn't have a lot of leverage.
And then they canceled a press conference. Was that maybe a way to avoid questions about this deal that might not have been a real deal at all?
That's a really good point. It definitely adds another layer to everything. And it makes you wonder what was really going on in that meeting. Was it about real diplomacy, or was it more about political games and power struggles?
Yeah. Big questions that are hard to answer.
But they're questions we need to ask.
Yeah.
Because they help us understand how power works on the world stage.
Exactly. And understanding that is important for everyone, not just world leaders, but anyone who wants to understand how international relations really work.
I couldn't agree more.
So as we kind of wrap up this whole deep dive into this Trump-Zelensky meeting, what's the big takeaway here? You know, for the average person trying to understand global politics and all the craziness that comes with it.
That's a good question. I think the main thing to remember is awareness. You know, we need to be aware of how perceptions are shaped, how narratives are built, and how those things can actually influence what happens on a global scale.
It's like we need some kind of special glasses to see through all the political smoke and mirrors.
I like that analogy.
How do we figure out what's really going on?
We have to become critical thinkers. Question what we see and hear, look for evidence, and try to understand different points of view. We can't just take things at face value anymore, especially when it comes to politics.
So it's like we have to become detectives.
Exactly. We have to piece together the clues, look for things that don't add up, and try to figure out why people in power are doing what they're doing.
And that can't be easy. We're constantly bombarded with information, and a lot of it's twisted or manipulated.
It's a challenge for sure, but it's a challenge worth taking on. What happens in the world affects us all.
It really does. The decisions world leaders make, the conflicts that happen, the policies that get put in place, it all impacts our lives.
That's why it's so important to be informed and engaged. The more we understand, the more we can make a difference.
Thinking back to this Trump-Zelensky meeting, What's the most important question we should be asking as we go forward?
I think the most important question is, how do we make sure diplomacy, actually solving problems peacefully through talking and negotiation, stays relevant in a world that's so obsessed with media and political showmanship?
It's a huge question,
Hmm.
and it's one we're going to be dealing with for a long time. It's a challenge to think critically about the world, to have real conversations,
Yeah.
and to push for a future where actions speak louder than words.
And a future where diplomacy wins out over drama, where working together can create a more peaceful and just world.
Well said. So I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into this wild meeting. We've covered a lot of ground, from international relations to the power of perception and how global politics are changing right in front of us.
It's been a fascinating discussion.
Huge thanks to you for guiding us through it all, and thanks to all our listeners for joining us.
Until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the things that matter.
And speaking of deep dives, if you're interested in how AI is changing warfare, you won't want to miss our next analysis. We're going to be breaking down the latest research and looking at the ethical questions around this rapidly developing technology, so stay tuned.